I am Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 7 of the JFK assassination, 60 years later. In 1969, a criminal prosecution took place in the city of New Orleans against a man named Clay Shaw. It was a state criminal prosecution, and it had been initiated by the district attorney in the county in which New Orleans, Louisiana is located, and that was Jim Garrison. Garrison, during the course of this trial, was rejecting the official lone nut narrative of the Kennedy assassination. He was alleging that this assassination was actually a regime change operation carried out by the U.S. national security establishment as part of national security. He was alleging that Clay Shaw had connections to this national security establishment through a relationship with the CIA. Clay Shaw, who took the witness stand, specifically denied that he had any connection to the CIA, and he was quickly acquitted. However, many years later, it was determined that he did, in fact, have a relationship with the CIA. Now, let me give you an interesting tidbit before I tell you exactly why I'm bringing up this trial at this point of this series. This trial, the Clay Shaw trial, and Jim Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw, actually served as the inspiration for Oliver Stone's movie in 1991, JFK. In fact, it might interest you to know that Garrison actually had a cameo role in that movie. He served as the judge rather than the prosecutor. Kevin Costner, of course, played the prosecutor, but Garrison served as the judge in that trial in the movie. So, notice the chain of events here. If Garrison had not prosecuted Clay Shaw, the probability is that Oliver Stone wouldn't have produced JFK, which would have meant there would have been no JFK Records Collection Act, and therefore there wouldn't have been an ARRB, and therefore it is highly likely that we never would have learned about the early introduction of the body into the Bethesda morgue. Or if we had learned about it, it would have been done with just the statements of some Navy enlisted men, which certainly would have been convincing, but without perhaps the testimony and the statements of Roger Boyden, the memorandum that the ARRB discovered from the Gawler's funeral home, and other evidence that the ARRB uncovered with respect to this autopsy. Now, why am I bringing up the Clay Shaw trial right now when we're talking about the early introduction of the body, President Kennedy's body, into the Bethesda morgue? Well, that would be because of the testimony of Colonel Pierre Finck. Now, who was Pierre Finck? Well, he was one of the 3 pathologists who carried out the autopsy on President Kennedy's body. The other 2 were Commander James Humes and Commander J. Thornton Boswell, both of whom were Navy, and Colonel Pierre Finck, who was Army. Finck testified in this trial that at 8 p.m. on the night of the assassination, November 22nd, he received a telephone call from Commander Humes. In that telephone call, Humes invited Finck to come to the Bethesda morgue to assist in the autopsy. Finck testified during the Clay Shaw trial that during that 8 p.m. conversation, Commander Humes told Finck that they already had x-rays of the president's head. Now, this is what the law calls an admission against interest. It's not exactly like a confession, but it's similar to a confession. A confession is considered in the law as extremely valuable, credible evidence because it's not in the interest of a person to confess to a crime. So if a person voluntarily confesses to a crime, the law places tremendous weight on the credibility of that confession. Now, we know that some confessions are forced and some people confess to crimes they don't ever commit. But by and large, a confession under the law is considered very, very credible evidence. An admission against interest is a little bit different, but very similar. An admission against interest is where a person admits to a fact or admits to an event that indicates criminal culpability And the reason the law places tremendous weight on an admission against interest as well is because it's not in the interest of a person to admit that he's been involved in some way or another with criminal conduct. And that's why the law places this tremendous weight. Now, why do I say that this is an admission against interest? Well, think about it. We've got Roger Boyden saying that the body was brought in at 6:35 p.m. We've got the Navy enlisted men saying that they met that black hearse outside the morgue and containing men with suits. We still don't know who those are. Militaries or the CIA, whoever it was, has always decided to keep those identities secret. They bring the body in a shipping casket rather than in the heavy, ornate casket in which the body had been placed in Dallas. Here is Colonel Finck, one of the 3 autopsy pathologists, who is acknowledging implicitly that this is exactly what happened with his admission against interest. See, this is what happens when people are concocting a complicated story. There's a lot of pieces to a story. It's very difficult for people to keep all the pieces straight. This is why, for example, in trials, the attorneys for one side or another will ask the witnesses that still have to testify to be removed from the courtroom so that they can't hear the testimony of the witnesses that are testifying, because they want the witnesses to stand alone with their testimony, because if they're making stuff up, it's very difficult to keep it all straight. And Colonel Finck's testimony establishes this. In other words, if Finck is told that they already have x-rays of the president's head at 8 p.m., and if the president's body is being brought into the morgue for the first and only time at 8 p.m., how can they possibly have x-rays of the president's head already? It's impossible. And that's the official narrative, that the president's body was brought into the morgue for the first and only time at 8 p.m. Here is Finck testifying under oath. Remember, he's under oath in this criminal proceeding. And he's testifying. He doesn't realize, obviously, the import of what he's saying. But he's there testifying under oath that at 8 p.m., Humes is telling him, we already have x-rays of the president's head. So this confirms everything that we've seen up to this point, including the x-ray technicians who said that they were down there taking x-rays in that earlier period. And remember, there was one of these enlisted men that went up to the upper level and saw Mrs. Kennedy coming into the front door when the gray Navy ambulance containing the Dallas casket is still outside in front. And so that enlisted man knew that casket from Dallas had to be empty because the president's body was downstairs. They were taking x-rays and doing other things that we will delve into later on. At this point, all we know is that something sinister is going on here, because none of this is normal, as anybody would define normal. Now, could this be a slip of the tongue by Colonel Finck? I don't think so, because guess what? Finck later gave testimony in another proceeding relating to the House Select Committee on Assassination's investigation into the assassination around the mid-70s. Let me tell you what he said there. Now, he was testifying in 1978 before the House Select Committee on Assassination's Forensic Pathology Panel. He said, I remember that on the phone, Dr. Humes told me he had good x-ray films of the head. That I remember. So he's confirming this. 6 years later or so after his testimony, his sworn testimony at the Clay Shaw trial. And he's actually emphasizing, he says, that I do remember, that he told me that we already had x-rays of the president's head. So here you have an admission against interest that really wraps up this issue. Remember, I told you that at the beginning of when we started to discuss this particular area, that I felt very strongly that you would conclude beyond not just a reasonable doubt, which is the standard of proof required in a criminal case, but that you would conclude beyond any doubt that this is what happened. And in my opinion, Finck's testimony in both places sworn testimony, wraps it all up. He puts the whole thing together with his admission against interest, the statements that were made by Roger Boyden, Boyden's after-action report stating the body was brought in at 6:35 p.m., the enlisted men, and so forth. Now, at this point, what I'd like to do is to do a recap. Okay, I like recaps because they help to remind people of where we are in this series, and they put things in a bigger context, in the context of everything we've seen so far. You'll recall that President Kennedy is declared dead at about 1 p.m. there at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. And at that moment, the Dallas County Medical Examiner, Dr. Earl Rose, announces he's going to do an autopsy. Now, this is required by state law. At that time, there was no criminal offense on the federal level of assassinating President Kennedy. The federal government had no jurisdiction over this crime at all. The jurisdiction lay exclusively within the authorities in Dallas County District Attorney's Office, the Dallas County Police, Dallas County Sheriff's Office, and so forth. And so the Texas law required an autopsy to be conducted by the medical examiner of the county in any homicide case. So Rose is just doing his duty. And at that point, a team of Secret Service agents, headed by a name named Roy Kellerman. Kellerman had been in the passenger seat, you'll recall, in the limousine in which Kennedy was traveling. When the shots rang out, he did not jump over the seat, as you would expect a Secret Service agent to do, to cover the president's body with his body. He just sat there like a bump on a log, looking at President Kennedy until he got shot in the head, and then his partner, William Greer, takes off and heads to Parkland Hospital. Well, when Dr. Earl Rose announces that he's going to conduct this autopsy, Kellerman goes into action. He's carrying a Thompson submachine gun, and he says, "Oh no, you're not. You're not gonna touch his body." And Rose stands his ground and says, "This is state law, bud. I mean, this is what I'm required to do. This is a homicide case. You can't lose the chain of custody of the body here." And at that point, the team of Secret Service agents pull their jackets back to brandish their guns. And so it's clear, and there's yelling and screaming. So it's clear that they're threatening deadly force. They're threatening to kill anybody that stops it. They're going to get this body out at all costs. Nothing's going to stop them. And Kellerman's saying, I'm following orders here. I'm operating on orders. So as if he's drawing on some kind of big authority. And as I indicated, the only person who could have issued those orders is Lyndon Johnson, the new president. Because Johnson heads over to Dallas Love Field and starts having his people remove the seats from the back of Air Force One. Even though he had said that he expressed a concern that this was the first stage in a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. He said that twice. It was all bogus, because he gets to the airport and he starts lollygagging around. If he really believed that, or believed there was any chance, as I indicated earlier, he'd have gotten up in the air immediately to defend America against this possible attack. He didn't do that. He lollygagged. In fact, his actions express a certainty that this was not the first stage in a nuclear attack. And the only way he could have been that certain, so as not to get up in the air and not take a chance that it might be, is that he knew exactly what was going on here. So he's having seats removed, and he knows that Johnson's a native Texan. He was a U.S. senator. He was a congressman. He knows that Texas law requires this autopsy. But he's over there having these seats removed because he knows that Kellerman's going to get that body out of there at all costs. Brandishing guns, if they have to shoot somebody, my hunch is they would have done it. They were following orders. You know how it is when people are following orders. And so remember that one presumably very large Secret Service agent picks up Dr. Rose and takes him over to a wall and puts him down and wags his fingers like saying, "No, no, no." And so they get that body out and they take it over there to the Air Force One, where Johnson's waiting for it, and they load it up there. Big, heavy, ornate casket. And they take off, and they land at Andrews Air Force Base. Now, if you were to just look at this Dallas episode, you might say, well, okay, Jacob, it's a little bit strange. Yeah, it's a little bit unusual. Maybe they overreacted to the situation. And now, if that was all there was, then, that would be one thing, sort of like a standalone event, and then everything else is normal. You could look at it and you say, well, okay, it's kind of weird, but, weird things happen in life. But when we look at what happened after that, and we put what happened in Dallas in the context of the overall sequence of events at Bethesda National Naval Medical Center, now we see something completely different. We see that the plan for the autopsy actually was launched at Parkland Hospital. That's where it starts. It's not just a standalone event. It's clear that the plan is to get this body out of Dallas without an autopsy. Do not let an honest autopsy be conducted here, and place it in the hands of the military where they can do a dishonest autopsy. Now, we'll examine the dishonesty and the fraudulent nature of this autopsy as we go along. But the first stage is what happens in Dallas. The second stage is what happens at Bethesda. And that's the early introduction of this body into the morgue. A secret introduction. An introduction that is still secret to this day because they won't acknowledge it. I mean, that's what's so funny about this thing. Like I said earlier, this event, the early introduction of the body into the morgue, has been airbrushed out of history. The mainstream press won't deal with it, never have dealt with it. They've gotten their cue from the Pentagon, the CIA, just act like it didn't happen. Do not acknowledge it. But what was interesting is, like, when Boyden testifies, his testimony before the ARRB, or his statements before the ARRB, ultimately become public. I mean, the mainstream press has access to all of the evidence that the ARRB has uncovered thanks to the JFK Records Collection Act, thanks to the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, thanks to the prosecution of Clay Shaw by Jim Garrison. The media's got all this stuff. They don't touch it. I mean, this is what's so fascinating. If anything shows the military nature of America's system, it's this: that not one investigative reporter for any of the mainstream newspapers, now, remember, this is long before the internet, but not one investigative reporter for the mainstream newspapers contacts Roger Boyden and says, okay, I've read your testimony here. I've read your statement to the ARRB. I've seen your after-action report that you submitted. I'd like to ask you some questions. And then they could get all his statements, and then they could go to the three pathologists and say, hey, this guy is over here saying that the body was introduced early. Commander Humes, is this really true? And what about Colonel Finck's testimony here? In 1990, they had Colonel Finck's, both of his testimonies before the House Select Committee and in the Clay Shaw trial. They don't touch it. They could have gone to Finck and said, Finck, what's the story here? You're saying that Humes already had x-rays of the president's head at 8 p.m., but the body was brought in at 8 p.m. That's the official version. How can they have x-rays of the president's head at 8 p.m.? This is all the mainstream press had to do. I should point out that at Parkland Hospital is undisputed they took no x-rays. So the x-rays that they already had to have come in this earlier time period. The mainstream press has never touched it at all. I mean, like I say, this is what life is like in a military nation. If the military and the CIA do not want the mainstream press to be investigating this episode, they're not going to investigate it. And so it's like I said earlier, like those Soviet officials that would fall out of favor with the Kremlin, that they would be sent to some gulag or something, and then they would take the photographs and just airbrush them out so that they don't appear in the photographs anymore. And then they'd have their names removed from the history books in the public schools and elsewhere where they just didn't exist. And so the younger generation would never learn that these people existed. Well, that's what they've done with this episode, the early introduction of the body into the morgue. They've just airbrushed it out of history. And they're just steadfast. They're not going to address this. All they're going to do is say, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory, which was the term that the CIA instructed the mainstream media to use, or at least its assets in the mainstream media to use, whenever somebody started pointing the accusatory finger over to the national security establishment. And that's fine. We got freedom of speech in this country, and everybody's free to say conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. That's fine. But hey, just explain to me how it is that they sneak this body in early. Why did they do that? If you just explain that to me, I'd be really happy. I mean, just explain to me why they snuck it in. Because by sneaking it in, they're essentially committing a criminal offense here. I mean, now, and as we go further, we'll see that there were some criminal offenses committed here. But I mean, tampering with a body is a criminal offense, and so they're obviously engaged in some sinister, dark, even evil conduct here. There's another thing to consider about this: that black hearse that brought the president's body in the shipping casket. Who are those people? Why has the military never identified those people? Why has the CIA never identified those people? Were they CIA? Was the CIA cooperating here? Now, why do I bring that particular episode up? Well, because this was an autopsy. I mean, an autopsy was, presumably going to be carried out by the autopsy physicians. That was Humes, Boswell, and Finck. The fact that this vehicle shows up with this shipping casket with President Kennedy's body in it is a very sinister thing, a very ominous thing, because it reflects that there's another force going on here. In other words, there's a secret force that is maneuvering the pieces on this chessboard. This isn't just three pathologists conducting an autopsy. Somebody is orchestrating events here. Somebody, or more likely, a group of people is orchestrating these things, because how else did that hearse get to Andrews Air Force Base? How did they get that body into the shipping casket? How did that shipping casket get into that hearse? Somebody is maneuvering these things, is orchestrating these things that are not the three pathologists. And that's something very, very sinister. So there you have it. You have the evidence establishing, in my opinion, beyond a doubt, that there was this early introduction of President Kennedy's body into the Bethesda morgue. Let's shift gears. The ARRB, the Assassination Records Review Board, also discovered another person who came to the ARRB and delivered an absolutely remarkable story. In fact, it's as remarkable, if not more so, than Roger Boyd's story. This person's name was Saundra Spencer. Now, Saundra Spencer was the chief petty officer. She worked for the Navy in the Navy's photographic lab there in Washington, D.C. And she specifically worked in the White House section of that photographic laboratory. As such, she worked closely with the White House, President Kennedy, and in the development mostly of social photographs, where the photographer would capture President Kennedy playing with his children or just walking down the beach with Jacqueline and so forth. And that social photographer was a man named Robert Knudsen. Now, Knudsen's another person that plays an absolutely fascinating role in this autopsy. In fact, I think you're going to be very, very intrigued when we get to Robert Knudsen's role in all this. In fact, I have no doubt you're going to be intrigued by it. But Knudsen was the social photographer, very reputable guy, very credible guy. He had worked for many presidents, not just Kennedy, Eisenhower. I think he goes back to Truman. He continued working with Johnson and maybe even beyond. And so he would take the photographs and they'd bring them over to this area in the Navy's photographic lab where Saundra Spencer her job would be primarily developing these photographs. Now, she was a very competent woman, very professional woman. I can't imagine finding a better, more credible witness than Saundra Spencer. In fact, Jeremy Gunn, the general counsel for the Assassination Records Review Board, a lawyer. He was the overall lawyer for the Assassination Records Review Board. He would do, I think, most, if not all, of the questioning of witnesses and so forth. He stated that of all the witnesses that appeared before the Assassination Records Review Board, he considered Saunders Spencer to be the most credible of them all. Saunders Spencer told the ARRB a remarkable story. She said that on the weekend of the assassination, she was summoned to develop photographs there at this laboratory pertaining to the autopsy. She had been made to understand that this was a classified operation. She could never talk about what she had seen. And she hadn't talked. 30 years or more than 30 years have gone by and she hasn't told anybody because she understands, like any military person does, what classified means. You don't talk about it ever. You take it with you to your grave. And so the ARRB, of course, released her from her vow of secrecy. And she proceeds to tell them that she developed the autopsy photographs for President Kennedy. So they show her the official autopsy photographs in the official record, and she focuses in on the photograph that depicts the back of President Kennedy's head. And she says, no, that is not the photograph that I developed pertaining to the back of President Kennedy's head. The photograph I developed showed a massive hole, like 2 inches or so, 2 inches in diameter, in the back of the president's head. Well, and sure enough, the official photograph in the record doesn't show any such massive hole. It shows the president's head to be essentially intact. Well, this obviously creates a big problem because either one version is right or the other version is right. They can't both be right. One version is false and one version is true. And if Saunders Spencer's testimony is correct and it's true, then that can only mean one thing: that the photograph that the military introduced as part of its official autopsy depicting the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact has to be fraudulent. It has to be false. There's no other way around it. Because she was firm that the photograph she developed showed a massive hole in the back of President Kennedy's head. Now, why is a massive hole there in the back of the president's head important? Well, recall the official narrative that the lone nut, Lee Harvey Oswald, supposedly fired 2 shots that hit Kennedy. One shot was the magic bullet that supposedly hit him in the back of the neck, came out the front of the neck, hits Governor Connally, breaks some ribs, goes through his wrists, breaks some wrists, lodges in his thigh, and comes out in perfect condition, pristine condition. Not even any blood on it, on the bullet. Okay, that was one bullet. The other bullet, they say, hit him in the back of the head from Oswald firing from the rear, and came out and shattered his entire top and side of the head off. So the reason that Saunders Spencer's testimony creates real big problems for this scenario is that she is saying that a bullet had to have come out, this is the implication of her bullet, had to have come out the rear. Because you see, when a bullet enters a person's body, it enters with a small hole, the size of the bullet, essentially. But it's pushing mass in front of it. And so when it comes out the other side, it comes out with a blowout. And so the import of her testimony is that President Kennedy was actually shot from the front. And there were, in fact, witnesses that said that he had a bullet entry wound in the right above his hairline in the right side of his head, and that it then blew out in the back of his head. So clearly, she is presenting real problems here, because if this photograph is fraudulent, and that's the import of her testimony, that clearly implies criminal conduct. Okay, a fraudulent photograph as part of President Kennedy's autopsy is clearly criminal conduct. So, where does that leave us? Is Sandra Spencer's testimony one of those standalone testimonies where it's one version versus another version? Well, not exactly. As we'll see in episode 8, her testimony actually confirms what the Dallas doctors at Parkland Hospital saw when they were treating President Kennedy before he died. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 7 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.